So just to let you know a little bit about what we thought, how we'd like to do now, because one of the core things that we do in teaching CCT is that we are curious. We're constantly curious about what does this practice do, what does it feel like, what does it look like, how do I struggle with it, what kind of issues show up. And, we can really get into these long ethical discussions about, what is compassion, how does it feel. So this tonight is really an invitation for you to really tap into that curiosity that hopefully has showed up for you as you were listening to Jinpa speak, and for us to have a conversation about not only our own personal practice, but also how do we think about bringing compassion into these different levels of society. So we may not find the answers, but we hope to at least have that conversation. So we're going to have mic runners, so just raise your hand with a question, and like Jinpa said, he'll do his best to answer if he knows the answer to it. So feel free to ask questions.
I may not know, but I will have an opinion.
Hello, my name is Nikolai. Thank you very much for the very interesting talk, first of all. You talked about the movement from compassion between individuals to compassion within certain sectors of our society, such as education or healthcare, which I see as being sort of obvious sectors in society where compassion will fit and be found. But what I really dream about is basically a society based on compassion. And I see some sectors of our society that are in dire need of compassion. So I dream about politics based on compassion, business built on compassion. Is that a completely unrealistic dream, do you think?
No, I don't think so. I think in the end, this is where we need to go. To some extent, if you compare the Anglo-Saxon world versus the Scandinavian world, the Scandinavian world have, in some sense, chosen to take compassion seriously in structuring their society. The fact that you have a much more conscious, progressive taxation system, where people above a certain level of earning don't mind paying higher level of tax, is a powerful recognition of the importance of compassion as a structuring of society. It's not just fairness. Some people might try to interpret this purely in terms of fairness. Fairness isn't that strong to understand this. This is really because one of the principles of compassion is to pay special attention to the needy. So those who are struggling, economically, the society as a collective has a responsibility to somehow provide a safety net. And so, and in this kind of society, basically, everybody stands to gain. It's no surprise that Scandinavian societies often come at the top of the happiest nations in the world, in the UN annual kind of, listing. So there are examples, but I think what is needed is to what extent the Scandinavian model is really, bringing compassion as an added moral consideration into the political mix or economic policy, or is it something that has completely been integrated into the basic economic thinking? That I don't know. If it is the latter, then it's more powerful. If it is the former, then it depends very much on the whims of the society. So so soon after the Second World War, probably the Europeans came out of a very dark experience. So probably there was a lot more impulse to create a structure that is more compassionate and fair. But if it is not, kind of integrated into the basic structuring of the society, then once you have wings of politics shifting, and then those who emphasize individual choice, freedom, and autonomy, and responsibility, state should not be paying for you and everybody, those kind of rhetoric takes over, and then it can change. So I think being able to somehow bring it to that level of discourse where somehow it has to shape the basic economic philosophy and political thinking, that needs to happen. And to some extent, we're beginning to see this today in the West, particularly in the West. We see businesses talking about social responsibilities. To what extent they're doing it, because in an internet age, everybody can put a star and rate them like or dislike. So to what extent they're doing it out of their self-enlightened interest, or to what extent it is reflecting a particular trend in society where younger generations are expecting some higher level of moral standard and responsibility, we don't know. But in the end, in the government policies, including especially economic policies, I think compassion really has to factor in. And at the moment, I don't think it plays an important consideration. And in the corporate world, I hope this current trend where corporations are increasingly feeling they need to show some social responsibility as part of their culture, I hope this is a trend that will move and keep evolving, and that is the opening for more compassion-based perspectives to come into the corporations. Because in the end, these days with social media and everything, the consumers have a lot of power. I mean, I have two girls. They don't have much spending power, but I do know that when they buy something, they actually check everything. Fair trade, social responsibility. I mean, this is pretty impressive. And imagine millions of young people doing this. That is power. So I hope, if nothing else, for their own self-interest, they will take compassion seriously.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Charlotte. Going off on our country being one of the most happy ones in the world, I also know that almost 450,000 people in this country are eating antidepressant medicine, which I think is very worrying. And I just want to hear from you if you can see how can we get rid of that, because I guess a lot of these people don't feel that they are right, since they have to take this medicine in order to be able to live a life.
Yes.
I mean, I think it's really sad, actually.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for bringing this up. There is clearly a rise in the level of anxiety. In the last Newsweek, there was a cover story on the increase in anxiety, particularly among undergraduates. This is, of course, primarily a story about US, but I would expect it to be pretty universal. And also, part of that is also, in the West, there is sometimes a tendency to over-medicate, because there is this kind of, we're so used to automation. When you switch on the light, it pops up. So we tend to emphasize quick fixes, and many of the chemical approaches, like the medication, tend to be faster. So I think part of the problem has also to do with this over subscription of these medication. In America right now, there's a middle part of America is going through a huge opioid crisis. Some of you who have read the stories. In fact, one of the very, very old, powerful drug makers, Purdue, is going to be filing bankruptcy because of the court cases against their role in the opioid crisis. So there's that, which is culture, and the pharmaceutical companies, of course, they are not out of compassionate motivation. They are there to make money. So I think it's probably what is required is a combination of many things. Clearly, there will be severe cases where you do need a pharmacological approach. I don't think mind-based approach works for everybody all the time. Clearly, there are issues to do with chemical imbalances, which are better dealt with using, chemical-based medication. But one thing that has been powerful about the mindfulness-based treatment is that it has shown when cognitive behavior therapy is combined with mindfulness, it's a powerful tool for prevention of relapse, not so much for treatment. The initial treatments seem to require some kind of pharmacological based approach. But in terms of prevention of relapse, they have shown this approach has shown to be as effective as using drugs. Now, if that is true, probably it's a harder thing to do because you need compliance, constant meditation, being able to learn the habits of the mind. But the good thing about non-pharmacological approach is then you are less likely to get addicted and have all these other side effects which chemical-based approach tends to have. So I think it's a combination of many things, but in many cases it may also be the problem of social connection. It's just not enough love in their life, not enough people caring about them. So in some cases probably an experience of loneliness and isolation, which are probably at the root. I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist, so I can't make too much conjectures here, but at least as a human being, I know what it feels like when I'm lonely. So I think, it's a combination of many factors, but I don't know what the actual solution is. Thank you. But the rise of anxiety seems to be more of a global phenomenon. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring talk. My name is Astrid. When you were talking before about moving from empathy to compassion, I'm very motivated by that thought of actually doing something and feeling, in a way, being soothed
Sure.
by actually being able to act and
Sure.
also maybe encourage others or
Sure.
enabling others to
Sure.
act.
Sure.
However, at the same time, I can feel very overwhelmed by all the types of suffering that we're surrounded with, and it can, in that way, also be very overwhelming to see how do I act or how do I manage all of this.
It's true.
Yeah.
True. I think this is where I think the wisdom part of compassion becomes important, because one thing that compassion teaches us is that not all problems can be fixed. The simple awareness that suffering is real and it's part of human reality, and in many cases what compassion demands is for you being there, showing recognition of the situation, but not necessarily, sort of putting pressure on you to solve everything yourself. I think is an important consideration. And also, suppressing your emotional response as a way of avoiding turns out to be actually a bad strategy. And in fact, if you look at the burnout literature among the doctors, among physicians, one of the important causes for burnout seems to be what they call depersonalization, which is a kind of a protection mechanism that the doctors adopt, where they don't engage, they don't feel for the person, the patient becomes a number. And that apparently is one of the major causes for burnout, because we are emotional creatures. If we choose to shut out, at some point it's going to take its toll. So I think denying and suppressing doesn't seem to work. So being emotionally moved, but also then bringing in some dose of realism that you're not going to fix fixing all your problem, all the problem, and what you can do is what you are able to do at any given moment. And I think this is where I think the Buddhist wisdom of emphasizing what you do rather than getting attached to a fixed outcome. It's a very hard thing to do because you want to be inspired enough to be able to motivate to do something, but you don't want to be overly attached to a particular outcome that you're looking for. And this is where I think the Buddhist wisdom of non-attachment is very helpful. Of course, then one can go to the extreme and become totally detached. So that's not what you want. I think it's really a question of bringing in wisdom, because if you allow yourself to be overwhelmed, then nobody benefits from this. You don't benefit, and the recipient of your action doesn't benefit either. So I think being able to recognize this, and as much as possible, being able to move from empathy to compassion. And then sometimes compassion need not translate into action, but at least it will translate into a wish to see the situation changed, which is a more powerful state than just simply being in the feeling zone. So I know it's doesn't give you any answers, but
So obviously it's a wonderful thing that secular mindfulness has such a broad appeal across the world, and now compassion is brought into it. But don't you think it would be more beneficial with the other four immeasurables, the Buddhist ideal of love, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity? And wouldn't that be great to bring into the game? And secondly, as your background in a traditional Buddhist background, wouldn't it also be when is the time right to call a spade and say mindfulness is a small aspect of a system of Buddhist philosophy and practice? If you want the full benefit, then there's a benefit of studying these traditional philosophy and psychology, which I know the Lama is promoting in India, for example, as not religion but psychology. So yeah, when are we ready?
Thank you. You're very ambitious. You're right, but on the other hand, there are Buddhist centers that offer these classes. So people who are interested in going deeper, they always have the opportunity to do so. But here we are talking broadly about a secular culture, and in that context, some of the very unique aspects of Buddhist teaching and practice may not be that easily translatable. Mindfulness and compassion are easily translatable because we are talking about like in the case of mindfulness, we are talking about a particular skill that can be trained. And in the case of compassion, we are talking about a universal human value that is at the heart of all the religions, and that relates to basic human condition. With respect to the other infinite, immeasurables like loving kindness, sympathetic joy, and equanimity, in the Tibetan tradition, although we have a prayer that has to do with daily prayer, that has to do with all the four immeasurables, when it comes to actual, cultivation and mental training, the tradition tends to emphasize compassion, to focus on compassion, and then see other three as elements of that practice. So loving kindness is establishing the base to connect with the other person. So this is where loving kindness, the friendliness, kind of a resonance and connection is where it's emphasized. Sympathetic joy is seen as more of an ability to deal with your tendency to be jealous of other people's happiness or success. So it's a way of dealing with a particular type of problem that arises as an obstacle for your cultivation of genuine compassion. And equanimity is seen as a kind of a skill where you develop a certain equilibrium so that you are not dislodged by all sorts of ups and downs and adversities. Again, the main focus is compassion cultivation, and those other three are seen as, complementary support practice to really further your compassion. So the Tibetan tradition tends to take this slightly differently. I know in the Theravada tradition, they put them all on a kind of equal footing and do them individually. But in the Tibetan tradition, it's like if you get compassion, there's a beautiful statement attributed to the Buddha in the Mahayana text. It says that what is that one thing when you have it in your hand, you have all the other virtues? It's compassion. So it's compassion is almost seen as the white panacea. It's the value of all the values kind of thing. So here in our work, it's it reflects that basic kind of thinking that once you focus on compassion, other qualities will come with it as a sort of a byproduct. Now, on the other more specific Buddhist, I think mindfulness and compassion are the two successful examples where adaptations of specific Buddhist-inspired practices can be brought into the larger world. And I'm sure, I don't think they are the only two. There might be others. But what is required is a kind of a very critical understanding of what the traditional roots are and their translatability across cultures and across language. And those are tough things. Sometimes, traditional Buddhists criticize mindfulness movement. Now, the same criticism will probably apply to compassion movement, that they are taking something out of the traditional context and appropriating it and using it for very secular, everyday needs. Because, compassion training in the Tibetan tradition was not designed for dealing with stress. It was designed to become a bodhisattva and then go on the path to become enlightenment. So it has a very strong religious and soteriological purpose, and training was part of that. What is happening in the secular context is taking it out and you really capturing what is universal about this teaching and practice that speaks to universal human experience, and then getting some techniques and trainings out of it that can be applied so that people can learn to make their compassion more active. So a lot of thinking has gone into this. But you're right, there might be other practices. For example, like equanimity practice could be a very powerful practice, but it needs to be done in a very methodical, careful way, because sometimes equanimity can be misunderstood as detachment. I remember once a Western Buddhist told me, she said she became a mother, and she said she feels guilty sometimes because she loves her child so much. I'm supposed to have equanimity. I said, you are holding it at the wrong end of the stick. I said, the idea of equanimity is that you train yourself to care for every child as much as you care for your own child. It's not the other way around. You're not supposed to bring your love to your child how you feel for others' kids. So there are these cultural dangers where you might misunderstand. And sometimes Buddhist detachment is really seen as indifferent. So those are cultural barriers. And also in Buddhism, there's a lot of, attachment is a baddie, You're supposed to have no attachment. But on the other hand, if you look at child developmental psychology, attachment is very crucial. If you don't learn to have a secure attachment based on a healthy relationship with your caregiver, you're in deep trouble. So attachment is a good thing. So again, there are many potentials for misunderstanding and miscommunication. So I think those work that needs to be done if it's going to be adapted. Like in the case of mindfulness, people like John Kabat-Zinn were very, very astute. They had deep experience. They have deep awareness and understanding of the traditional Buddhist context. he was a doctor. He was a professor in medical science. He also had a very acute understanding of the need of secular society, and was able to develop something like MBSR. So you need whoever's going to do this kind of translation across cultures need to be someone who has their feet in both cultures and tradition, so that they know exactly what they're doing. So that's why it's tough.
Thank you so much for a really inspiring and important talk. I guess my question is sort of around this sort of compassion deficit era we seem to be living in. And you mentioned that empathy is sort of a pathway or becoming to compassion. So becoming aware of other people and their suffering and their situations. So I guess my question is, how would one go about facilitating this opening or
Yes.
awareness
Yes.
in others, so that we can be all a part of elevation and moving towards the ideal of being able to have compassion institutionalized in our structures?
Sure. That's a really good question. There is enough evidence to show that there is a decrease in empathy in society. There's a fair bit of data on American students. Again, a lot of these data come from America because that's closest where I live, and I read in English, not in other European languages. So there is enough data showing a worrying trend among students where there is a decrease in empathy. And to what extent it has to do with excessive exposure to digital devices, because we are now beginning to have some idea of their effect, and to what extent it has to do with parents' overemphasis on achievements and other performance based kind of values versus demonstrating love and compassion in their own family life. I don't know, it's a difficult thing, but you are right, it is an important issue, because if right from the beginning people switch off empathy, there's no place for compassion. That's just with all the best intentions in the world. I mean, one of the things about compassion is you can't force someone to be compassionate. It's a bit like falling in love. You can't force someone to fall in love. It's a bit like happiness. You can't force someone to be happy. Happiness, compassion, love, falling in love, they tend to come as a byproduct. The only thing that you can do is to create the conditions. And the condition is empathy for compassion. And so my own sense is that this is one area where I think the media can play a very powerful role. Storytelling is, and we know younger generations consume a huge amount of video. If you look at newses, these days, even serious newses like BBC on the online version has a lot of short videos, and most younger people, they just watch the video rather than read. So I think storytelling, and I think is probably a powerful factor. And also within the family, I think the parents need to show that they care about the world. I think this, in the end, if children are going to get values, the early place where they absorb and internalize values is at home. After a certain age, parents don't have much influence. We like to think we have quite a bit of influence, but their peers are much more influential. But at the beginning, I think there is a tremendous opportunity for parents to inculcate their values in children. The way parents themselves treat each other, the tone of voice they adopt, some showing some affection and compassion, and also talking about all situations in a way that does not rule out empathy for people who are different. And I think also being able to, for example, every now and then we have crises. And I know that the Western world is quite compassionate, because if you look at the giving as a behavioral, expression of compassion, Western world tends to always be on the top. So clearly, and part of that probably has to do with Christian background. Christianity is one of the great religions that really emphasize compassion. One could almost argue that the New Testament is a text scripture that shines the spotlight on compassion as a key value. So I think that Christian influence in the Western world is probably what makes West, care and give. But I think as the world becomes more and more complex, as societies become less homogeneous, and this is part of the problem that the Europeans are experiencing, because North America and other places are not that homogeneous, so differences is not really a huge issue. And particularly where I live, Canada is a nation of immigrants, so it's not really a huge issue to see differences and to see people speak different languages. But European nations, which have traditionally been homogeneous, I think are going to face this challenge, and without some degree of migration, the population math wouldn't work, because the natives are not producing enough children to be able to maintain a viable, existing society. So you do need immigration. So I think in those kind of situations, as parents, being able to talk about unity in differences, being able to talk about common humanity, those kind of things are really going to be crucial, because it's very difficult if you're not exposed to that way of thinking early to then be expected to have that kind of attitude to others who look very different. It's very different. It's very different. Difficult. So I think it's a larger challenge, and I think perhaps one of the things that is important is for parents to, of course, as parents, when our children get a high score, we can't restrain ourselves from showing joy, and if they win a tournament. But along with it, we also need to show that the child's sense of worth is not contingent or conditional upon how they perform. Their child's sense of worth needs to be also grounded in their ability to be kind, in their ability to be considerate. I think those are very complex parenting questions, and it puts a certain responsibility on us as parents, being able to demonstrate it, not just talk. It's not very compelling for children to be told what to do. It's more compelling if you live it and show it. And I think here, if we are serious about our concern of deficit and empathy among younger generation, I think we need to take seriously how we parent the next generation. Anyway, that's my feeling.
Okay, my name is Anne-Mette. Thank you for a very interesting speak. What's in my mind now is, how come we as human beings are not more compassionate? Because it's so obvious somehow.
True.
For me, being a Dane, my experience is actually that, this self-compassion as parents, as workmates, we really need something there. To really love ourselves, not with the emotions, but actually understand ourselves, that the emotions are telling us things,
Sure.
whether they are good emotions, nice emotions,
Sure.
or not nice
Or
emotions,
difficult, yeah.
and being witnesses, to each other really help us there, because it should be like this,
It's true.
but it's not happening.
It's true.
And this is actually, a society issue that we really need to take, as I see it, from the bottom.
Bottom up, yeah.
Starting with ourselves.
Sure.
Basically.
Thank you for the question. I think it's a very important question. I remember many years ago, I was at a conference in this beautiful part of Italy, northern Italy. It was a small group of us. We were there for 3 days together on consciousness. I brought up as part of my presentation compassion. And one of the scientists there said, if compassion is that good for us, we humans would have been doing this for a long time, because evolutionary prefers us to choose what is good for the survival. That was a difficult question. I actually, it made me think, because generally that's what evolution is supposed to do. Evolution is supposed to predispose us to choose what is good for our species propagation. I don't think I've come up with any final answer to this, difficult question. But I do think that I've begun to appreciate that the complexity of human emotions. We are very complex creatures. We have our dark side, and we have our, better side, and we are constantly pulled in different directions. The primitive part of the brain makes us respond to situations from this fight or flee, fight or flight kind of response, that threat detection. We also have a whole range of emotions which are manifestations of these, impulses in us, whether in the form of fear, whether in the form of anger, aggression. So I think compassion is part of one of those motivation systems, and I don't think, we have learned to consciously tap into that part of who we are in a more disciplined manner. So we are at the mercy of a situation, and depending on how we react, and part of which also is habit, we learn the habit fairly early, and then we react. So the same situation could have been reacted from the place of compassion, but often we choose not to, because that's a slightly tougher one. Whereas anger and denial and aggression is much easier, they're swifter. And we tend to go for the simple kind of reactivity. So I think, but having said this, now that we know enough, we don't really have an excuse. In the past, we did not know, one could argue. Religions have given us instructions, but the religion's approach has generally been not very successful. Religion's approach has been primarily using guilt and shame, you don't be selfish kind of thing, and that kind of telling off probably works when you're small because you're afraid, but as you grow older, I don't think that approach works. But now, with science coming into the picture, with these secularized trainings out there, we have a lot more skills, and we are beginning to see individuals who make the choice, and they live a better life. They may be living the same neighborhood, maybe living the same socioeconomic kind of standard of life, but individually, experientially, they live a different life, and that is a fact. So I think as programs like this become more widely available, and as society values compassion more widely, and hopefully with important sectors of our society encouraging it, people will find it easier to bring that part. So that's my hope.
One more question. Where actually at my working place working with this, how to, as high performance team, being vulnerable,
yes,
working with this, actually give more to the table than you take.
That's true.
But as you said, with the competitiveness, it's going around this, looking into it, that is actually beneficial for
yes.
The
I think
the whole society, the person, the group, the whole society, the
Sure.
organizations.
Sure. I think in the end, it's probably a question of critical mass. Yeah. So if you have enough critical mass in a particular work setting and culture, then someone told me that actually it's Casey, our executive director of Compassion Institute. I don't know whether she has any data, but she believes it's 10%. If you have a 10% of a particular cultural environment that takes compassion or mindfulness seriously, that has the ability to bring the 90%, into it. So I think it's 10% is doable. But there was also a study that showed, and I read about a couple of months ago, an amazing, and I think it was a research study, but there was an article that came out of it. It looked at, freedom movements, and found out, this woman who did a study, found out that historically, all the freedom movements that have used nonviolent methods, where 3% of the entire population has come out in the streets and participated actively, have always succeeded. Imagine, only 3%. That's actually doable. We're beginning to see some of that in Hong Kong. We'll see how the story ends. But it looks like, for mass movements, of course, you need to use non-violent methods. If it is strictly non-violent, and if you're able to convince 3% of the population to come out actively, and this is why, movements like Greta Thunberg's approach is powerful. She is galvanizing and inspiring a whole generation of young students. I think it's in the end, it's critical mass. So the pioneers like those in the room here, we have a responsibility.
So we have time for one last question.
Okay.
And then we're going to wrap up. So,
hello, my name is Birgitte. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. My question is a little bit about the Buddhist concept of not self. And can you talk a little bit about the importance of not self? Because for me, it seems to be very connected to the ability to be compassionate, not always putting yourself first.
Yes.
You said something about if you cannot feel the joy of your child, then you're in trouble.
Yeah, as a parent, of course.
That touches into that because as a parent, I'm not a parent, but I imagine you give up some sort of yourself.
Sure.
And do you see compassion stronger in the eastern parts of the world where Buddhism is, or that value, maybe not even Buddhism, but that value or concept is more integrated?
Yes. I think it's a tricky question because, I'm an Asian, so I can say this without being accused of being cultural critic or racist. I would argue, actually, when it comes to compassion, as a society, the Western Christian-rooted cultures tend to be much more compassionate. Now, individually it's different, but as a society, and that is manifested in the way in which, when there are major crises like the Asian tsunami, Haiti tsunami, if you look at the proportion of giving of individuals, not just nations, nations also, but generally individual giving, the West really beats everybody. And in an interesting way, America actually tops. So, and Americans see themselves as a very strongly Christian nation. So there is something about the connection between Christianity and compassion. People may choose not to see themselves as religious, but you can't avoid being influenced by your cultural roots. Even the word conscience, forgiveness, if you dig deep, there's a lot of Christian, insights embedded in those. And that's the language we use. So I would say, as a society, the West probably are more compassionate, at least at this point. So the connection between, and also the no-self teachings, the Buddhist teaching on no-self is actually a philosophical teaching. So it's not really, I wouldn't expect it to be shaping ordinary lay people's life. It's quite a high level teaching, and it's really basically, even among monastics, it's only a small proportion who has learned to embody it and live it. So the connection between Buddhist concept of no-self and compassion isn't that obvious. So when we talk about being less selfish, then we are talking about not a philosophical concept. We are talking about a psychological attitude. And there, the connection between self-centeredness and lack of self-centeredness and compassion is very strong. Because if you're too self-centered, you're going to have less room for others in your heart, which means you're going to be more close towards others' suffering. If you have a more expansive sense of self, you have less, grasping at yourself, then you're going to be more compassionate. So in a psychological sense, strong sense of self, having a excessive focus on self versus less focused on self and compassion seem to be quite strong. But the philosophical concept of no self and compassion is a different one. And the basic idea behind the Buddhist theory of no self is to argue that at the root of all of our difficult emotions that manifest in the form of anger, aggression, attachment, and all of this is a deeply held belief in a core you, for whose purpose you're doing everything to protect it, and anyone who you see as threatening that core you react with anger. Anyone who you see as somehow beneficial to that real you feel attached and you grasp. So that and the idea here is that this self, if you examine carefully, is a construct. There's no real me hiding somewhere in us, and this is where there's this beautiful passage in the David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, where he says that whenever I look for myself, I find nothing but bundles of experience and perception. So even the brain scientists do not find an executive controller somewhere. Our mental experience is coming from a powerful, beautiful synchronization of activities across a network. There is no real executive control section somewhere. So that's what Buddhists are trying to get at. But on the other hand, we do need for our own experience to have some working hypothesis of a self, because we are a physically bounded individual. I know I'm not you, and you know you're not me. So there is a physical boundedness that gives, and every single culture, accords respect to that individuality. One of the cultural universals is that every single culture, individuals have a name. It's not just in the West. Every single culture, individuals have a name. That is to show the respect for the individual. So there is a boundedness, but that sense of self, whether there is a real me behind that label, that is a philosophical question. And Buddhists generally say no. And then the other non-Buddhist Indian traditions accuse Buddhists of being nihilist. So it's more of a philosophical, and also it's more to do with complex kind of psychology, understanding what pins our emotions. But the connection between psychological, sort of focus on self and compassion, that is a strong one. So it's a very difficult question. Yeah, and sometimes just because there is an idea in a particular society does not mean that idea shapes the life in that, because there is a huge gap between idea and practice. So in the West, when Christianity was a dominant religion, love your neighbor was a very important, dictum, but that did not mean that everybody was doing it. So I think there's always a big gap between what a religion or a philosophy says and what people do in that culture.
Thank you so much.
On that note,
on that small note, just on behalf of the Danish Center for Mindfulness, I just want to thank all of you for being here, for thinking that compassion is something that we need to think about and bring into our lives and the worlds that we live in, but also the bigger world. And Thupten Jinpa, thank you so much for your inspirational talk and for being here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.
One last thing, if you would like your book signed by Jinpa, he said he would be more than happy to do that, so you can bring it down here and he will sign it for you.
And thank you for your patience and attentiveness. Thank you.